Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Why Literature podcast. I'm your host, Leo Rothschild, and the focus of today's episode is a short poem called Aunt Jennifer's Tigers by a great, but I think underappreciated 20th and early 21st century poet named Adrienne Rich. I'd like to get things started today by reading the poem in its entirety. Aunt Jennifer's Tigers by Adrienne Rich. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across the screen, bright topaz denizens of a world green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree, they pace in sleek chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So my goal in this podcast is twofold. While I would certainly like to analyze this poem in depth, I would also like to think hard about how we usually undertake such an analysis. Let me explain. In my experience, the deep analysis that and I think most students have been taught, involves three things: close reading of the text, research into a text's historical background, and/or research into an author's biography. Let's consider each of these approaches in turn. First, we've been taught to close read the poem to discover the various tensions and themes. To use Aunt Jennifer's Tigers as an example, we might note the tensions between aunt and uncle, women and men, and thereby uncover a theme or a message that involves the ways in which men seek to control women, leaving them, quote, terrified when they long to be, quote, proud and unafraid, like the tigers on Aunt Jennifer's, quote, screen. Alternatively, or perhaps in addition, we have been taught to consider the historical context in which the poem was written. From this perspective, the, quote, massive weight of Uncle's wedding band in Rich's poem might be understood to reflect the pressures of life in Cold War America, the general pressure of a national agenda that, according to a recent PBS article on women in the 1950s, touted the warmth and power of the American nuclear family in opposition to the impersonal, collective-mindedness of communism, and the, quote, tremendous societal pressure on women in that cultural moment to, quote, focus their aspirations on a wedding ring. Finally, we have been taught to look at an author's life for clues. Thus, we might ask the following about Rich. Who is she, and what can we find out about her life that could help us understand the meaning of her poem? What could have shaped her ideas, and how does that change the way we think about her work? A reading of Aunt Jennifer's Tigers through this sort of biographical lens would most likely focus on the hardships of motherhood with which Rich grappled, or maybe on the difficulties and conflicts that characterize her marriage with Alfred Conrad. Given that, after the death of her husband, Rich began a long-standing relationship with the novelist and editor Michelle Cliff. This hypothetical biographical reading might even suggest that Aunt Jennifer's stifled identification with the tigers she creates reflects Rich's own desire to overthrow heteronormative marriage in favor of same-sex partnership. Read from this perspective, the poem thus becomes a reflection of Rich's life and psychology. Each of these approaches, close reading, researching historical background, and researching biography, has its appeal. However, I can't help but think that each of these approaches is also problematic. Each of these approaches, close reading, researching historical background, and researching biography, has its appeal. However, I can't help but think that each of these approaches is also problematic. If we only close read the text, we run the risk of ignoring its place in history and anachronistically imposing our own views and values when we try to identify a theme. When we look at history as context and background, we turn the text into a reflection of an oversimplified historical moment. Perhaps the most dangerous of all, in my view, is when we read literature as a reflection of an author's life or a manifestation of the author's psychology. When we do this, we flatten both the life and the literature in question to come up with an all-too-easy thesis. Lives are complicated, and I feel that oversimplifying Rich's life in this manner does her person and her verse a disservice. So, what is the alternative? I would suggest that we try a new historical reading of Rich's poem. What that entails, as I understand it, is resituating her work within the broader cultural conversation of which it forms a part. Not history as background or context, but history as conversation, as discourse. To narrow things down from the overly broad topic of women in America, let's look back at America in the 1940s and 50s with a specific eye on the discourse surrounding women in the workplace. After all, the Aunt Jennifer in Rich's poem is engaged in work that has historically and stereotypically been assigned to women, weaving. We'll look briefly at a variety of texts that advance various and often contradictory views about women and their roles at work and in society. Having reconstructed this cultural conversation, we will then turn back to Rich's poem to try to better appreciate what it achieves on its own terms, rather than using current 21st century values and ideas about gender roles as a measuring stick. So let's listen to some other voices from the 40s and 50s expressing ideas about women and work. First, I want you to hear a clip from a 1959 instructional film produced by the Calvin Corporation to train its supervisors about how to handle women employees. This film is called The Trouble with Women.
Question. All these things you've been talking about, marriage, absenteeism, personality problems, aren't they really just a part of life?
Part of a woman's life, maybe. But I can remember the good old days when there were all men in my department, and we didn't have these problems.
You didn't have the production output you've got now either. Look, Brad, you've got a new bearings inspector who happens to be a woman. You need someone, and there isn't a man available. It seems to me that whether the gal adds up to trouble or not is pretty much up to you.
Clearly, the entire premise of this short film is misogynistic and patronizing. However, neither the man complaining about his female employees recalling the good old days before World War II, back when men did the jobs men were naturally made to do, nor his supervisor are necessarily ill-intentioned. The supervisor in particular defends the new female inspector, saying that the production output has increased and these problems he is mentioning are inherent to anybody's life. As well-intentioned as the supervisor may be, however, he too dehumanizes women in the workplace because he sees them simply as a business item. Given that their output is high, he seems to say the company might as well keep them even if they are only women. There's a basic shared assumption at play here that men understand manufacturing and machines naturally, and thus they are the real driving force in the workplace. Both men in the clip are perfectly blind to the fact that, like women, men must be trained to learn such skills, and that women are just as capable of such learning as men and should be regarded as such. Of course, this video does not represent an isolated pair of voices. In fact, it is part of a chorus of similar voices that constitute the loudest group in a wider cultural conversation. Rewinding to the early 1940s, during World War II, when men were serving in Europe and Japan, women filled the void in the domestic workplace, helping to keep the economy running while these men were abroad. During this time, the first guides were written on how to manage women in the workplace. A 1940s Radio Corporation of America brochure contained a series of tips on how to manage women in the workplace. These images, also included in the transcript, are from that very brochure. With notes such as, quote, suggest rather than reprimand, and, quote, when she does a good job, tell her so, make it sound as though the supervisor is supervising a highly intelligent dog who needs to be sternly corrected when disobedient, but earns a scratch behind the ears and a biscuit when well behaved. Moreover, the title of this card, Women Are Teachable, suggests there is some sort of revolutionary or progressive realization on the part of men who created this brochure. It endorses the idea that teachability is something that needs to be pointed out explicitly. As you can see, the subsequent two images are similar in nature. They name a generalized trait, patience, and cooperation, and instruct supervisors how to best cultivate and secure these qualities in women in order to maximize corporate efficiency, stating things like, quote, don't change your shift too often and never without notice, and, quote, discover personal causes of poor work, absenteeism, turnover. Needless to say, these directives are hardly exclusive to women. Are men simply thrilled when their shifts are changed on them at the last moment with no notice? But they are also treated by these documents as special considerations to allow for weakness and sensitivity of women. While we might easily find many more texts voicing similar sentiments, it is also important to consider dissenting perspectives. In popular media of the period, Wonder Woman offers a famous example of a voice that seems outspokenly feminist, but has fundamental problematic issues. Let's take a look at this image, also seen in the transcript, from the early frame of the Wonder Woman days in issue number 32, released in 1948. In the comic, the hero urges, "Oh, you stupid girls, when you let men bind you, you let yourself be bound by war, hate, greed, and lust for power. Think, and free yourselves. Control those who would oppress others. You can do it." While Wonder Woman's words are certainly progressive compared with the film and posters we have just examined, both the writers and the audience toward whom the comic are directed are male. As superficially progressive as Wonder Woman's words are, she is routinely depicted to cater to the male gaze and male desire. She is proportioned to make her into a desired sex object, largely because she was made, illustrated, and scripted by men for men. While this may not be ill-intentioned, this fundamentally undermines any real or substantive messages of progressiveness and female empowerment. Moreover, her symbolic breaking of the chain of the patriarchy is also naive and unrealistic. If only overthrowing patriarchal norms were as easy as breaking a steel chain. Similar to Wonder Woman, yet different in several aspects, comes our final piece of the cultural conversation that we're creating today, Rosie the Riveter. Like Wonder Woman, Rosie the Riveter arose from illustrations by a man in a time of great change in the workplace due to the war. The famous poster was created in 1942 by the artist J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Company's War Production Coordinating Committee. The poster at first glance seems fairly positive. A robust and muscular Rosie is a symbol to inspire women to step up for their country in a time of need. However, the poster is essentially a propaganda creation of the state and the patriarchy. The optimistic slogan, "We can do it," is fairly ambiguous. Who are we, and what is it that we can do? It fails to appreciate and recognize what women are really up against. While on the surface it is well-intentioned and challenges gender norms, there is also a subterranean motive. It implicitly tells women to step up for the men, to do their womanly duty on the home front because they are unfit for the battlefield. Now that we have explored the pervasive presence of the dominant patriarchal voices that resounded, that instructed, that dictated the behaviors of women in the workplace in 1940s American society, let us return to Aunt Jennifer's Tigers again, this time with knowledge of this broader cultural conversation. Clearly, the poem speaks against and challenges the overarching patriarchal ideologies embraced by cultural texts like the Calvin Corporation film or the Radio Corporation of America brochures. Moreover, it is far more self-aware than the coercive power of such ideologies than texts like Wonder Woman or Rosie the Riveter. Indeed, the poem exposes the way patriarchal ideology is ingrained and absorbed by Aunt Jennifer. The lines, the quote, "massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand," convey succinctly the way such ideologies systematically pressure women and constrain women and seek to shape what they think of as appropriate or even possible. Once absorbed, these ideologies are no less restrictive and far more than the literal chains that Wonder Woman snaps in the comic strip. If only it were so easy. Aunt Jennifer is bound by the chains of patriarchy, and she cannot just break through because her mind has been circumscribed by cultural ideas of heteronormativity in work. She is doing the traditional form of women's work, weaving, and this is her only outlet of expression for her rage and aspirations. Heartbreakingly, the narrator informs us that when Aunt Jennifer dies, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by, end quote. The verb ringed echoes the wedding ring of the previous stanza, making it plain that the ordeals she was mastered by are the products of patriarchal expression. While all of this may sound pretty dark and depressing, I think Rich's poem offers a glimmer of hope. After all, Aunt Jennifer creates tigers that silently capture the pride and bravery that she herself never manages to voice. And perhaps more importantly, the unnamed niece who narrates the poem does give voice to all the things that her aunt never dared to speak by voicing the poem itself. So when we take a step back and we see where Aunt Jennifer's Tigers fits into the cultural conversation about women in the workplace, we can more accurately gauge how progressive it is. Other people aren't doing what Rich is doing here. With Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, Rich thwarted ideas of traditional gender roles. Unlike her aunt who faces these norms in a silent fashion through weaving these tigers and is not proud and unafraid, she lived her life afraid, Rich is. Rich is not knitting tigers, she is writing poetry and fearlessly giving her ideas public voice.